Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to be here and truly an honor for me to be with you this morning. Deepest thanks to our organizers, our sponsors, to my chair, co-panelists, and also to you outstanding participants and distinguished guests in the audience who make all of this worthwhile. Thank you so much for inviting me here and also for your wonderful company. In preparing for today's event, I submitted a paper some weeks ago entitled Public Law Under Stress: War, Crime, and Terrorism. The paper is far too lengthy for me to read here. Perhaps it's also too boring, I don't know. But I can perhaps summarize it quickly on my way to a few specific points that I hope might be interesting to this esteemed audience. At its core, the paper has a historical side and an analytical side. I identify about a dozen episodes spanning 2 centuries of U.S. history that have created or perhaps fallen into ambiguous zones that overlap among what modern observers might call war, or they might call crime, or they might call terrorism. I should stress at this point that I'm not using U.S. history because it's inherently important, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but rather because U.S. history is what I know, or have the best chance of knowing, and perhaps it may illustrate ambiguities of crime, terrorism, and war. For example, in the American case, I suggest that even the biggest and most identifiable wars in U.S. history, the Revolution, the Civil War, and World War II, even those wars had elements that could have been recharacterized as counterterrorism, if not ordinary crime fighting. Likewise, some of America's most important periods of criminal law, including bans on alcohol and drugs and conflicts with organized criminal organizations, have shared the rhetoric and some of the realities of counterterrorism, if not actual war. And perhaps most importantly, the longest conflicts in U.S. history, often forgotten or too often forgotten, were those conflicts fought against Native Americans, even though it was never at all clear whether those episodes qualified as war, as crime, as terrorism, or as something else entirely. In the paper, the analytical point behind this murky history is simple, and perhaps to some of you it will be quite familiar. I propose that 21st century ambiguities surrounding the concepts of war, terrorism, and crime are not at all new, not even in the United States, where they are most often viewed as such. In turn, ambiguities about war, crime, and terrorism may not be solvable by simply drafting better definitions of the 3 terms, and thereby resolving, for example, is fighting Al-Qaeda war, is fighting financial supporters war, is fighting governments who harbor or don't cooperate war, is fighting any kind of so-called Islamist violence war, or are some or all of these conflicts terrorism instead? Are they just crime? In many respects, the political rhetoric of war, terrorism, and crime may be irrelevant or even misleading in describing threats to liberal democracy. Maybe that's a controversial thing to say, but another way of looking at it is that the complexity of terrorism, one of the complexities of terrorism, lies in its relationship to other forms of anti-legal, anti-social violence. Let me phrase the point more generally. Conventional wisdom often views war as a distinctive and existential threat to liberal democracies. This idea is sometimes used to justify extreme governmental responses, consistent with the U.S. Supreme Court's own statement that, quote, "the Constitution is not a suicide pact," end quote. In war, one might say, perhaps anything goes. After all, it's a matter of life or death. By contrast, under conventional wisdom, terrorism, and most especially crime, are typically viewed as more manageable, ordinary threats to liberal democracy and order. Indeed, this is why American rhetoric, like the war on crime or the war on terror, has such political power. At least metaphorically, these terms indicate a no-holds-barred seriousness, kind of like a war. The United States history, however, shows that the existential threats posed by war are not unique to war. For example, conflicts with Native Americans, whatever they might properly be called, those conflicts were literally crucial to establishing the sovereign authority of the United States and to relentlessly eviscerating that of Native American groups. Likewise, historical crimes in the United States associated with, in the past, slavery, labor unrest, alcohol, and drugs, these crimes were understood in their own eras as threatening the most basic foundations of America's social order. Serious crimes, like serious terrorism and serious wars, all three pose fundamental threats to a liberal democracy. On my reading of America's history and its governmental responses, greater analytical emphasis should be placed on what qualifies as serious as compared with relatively abstract interpretations of war, crime, and terrorism. My paper, therefore, concludes with a few brief thoughts about what kinds of indicators of seriousness are most likely to trigger extreme governmental responses, and in turn, what should trigger corresponding caution about governmental abuse. So that concludes my summary of the paper, and naturally, I suppose, like any author, I'm more than happy to discuss any elements that may have drawn your attention. Nevertheless, with your indulgence, I'd like to now use the paper's arguments to emphasize a more modern history and to make a more urgent analytical point. For students of American politics, it was President George W. Bush who coined the term war on terror in response to the 9/11 attacks. And during his administration, the term war was not just an empty political phrase. For example, President Bush claimed that he had constitutional authority to detain suspected terrorists at Guantanamo Bay without formal charges and without judicial supervision. His legal arguments for that position relied on Supreme Court cases from World War II concerning a president's war power. President Bush also claimed that he could wiretap U.S. citizens in violation of federal statutes, again, relying upon cases that concerned presidential authority during World War II. President Bush further claimed that he could charge, prosecute, and punish terrorists as war criminals tried in specially tailored military commissions, once more, because that's what he thought presidents could do in times of war. If today's panel of speakers had been conducted 10 years ago, just after the Turkish Republic's 80th anniversary instead of its 90th, one burning issue for our discussion would have been what exactly war means in this context. Can there really be a war against terrorism, we might have asked? If so, who are the belligerents? What are permissible tactics? And perhaps most importantly, when and how might such a war end? Who can make the peace? When Bush was the American president, some legal academics and public intellectuals thought that by answering these kinds of questions, and perhaps by more narrowly defining and specifying the meaning of war, important steps could be taken toward limiting terrible abuses such as Abu Ghraib, rendition for torture, waterboarding, and secret CIA dark sites. As it happens, however, just one decade later, the presidency and re-election of Barack Obama have taught a very different lesson. On January 21st of this year, President Obama announced to the United States and the world, quote, "A decade of war is now ending. We, the people, still believe that enduring security and lasting peace do not require perpetual war. On May 23rd, he continued, quote, "We must define our effort not as a boundless global war on terror, but rather as a series of persistent, targeted efforts to dismantle specific networks of violent extremists that threaten America," end quote. "The war," President Obama said, "is over, and the peace," he implied, "has begun." In October 2013, however, the deepest question is no longer whether some technical definition of war continues onward today or has already been concluded. Nor is the deepest question whether terrorism is in reality a form of crime, a form of warfare, or something different altogether. On the contrary, the deepest question is, and it always has been, what exactly a liberal democracy does or does not do, what it should or should not do in pursuing various forms of national security and order. To snatch issues from newspaper headlines, one might ask, do liberal democracies, should they tap the communications of their own citizens and or international allies? Do they, should they, launch automated drone strikes against specific individuals? Do they, should they continue with some number of Guantanamo detentions, with some number of trials by military commission? And so the list could go on. This striking juxtaposition of President Bush's war presidency with President Obama's peace presidency is clear proof, consistent, I think, with my paper's historical and analytical thesis, that labels are not everything. Indeed, perhaps sometimes they don't count for very much at all. In the field of national security, some observers see far more continuities between President Bush and President Obama than they see differences. And if that is so, then the rhetoric of war, with its arguably quaint images of formal combat, uniformed soldiers, and temporal limits, that rhetoric of war may be a regrettable distraction. The United States, and perhaps some other liberal democracies, may have already proceeded a long way toward crafting institutional structures that will last far beyond any plausible definition of war or even of terrorism. In this sense, it may be more ordinary nouns, nouns like crime, safety, security, or even order itself, that pose the deepest threats to the kinds of values that liberalism and democracy are thought to represent. Or at least, I should say that threats of violence and government excess predate the term terrorism and most probably will survive regardless of that label. In conclusion, perhaps the problem may not be simply that leaders and societies manipulate slippery terms like war, terrorism, and crime in the service of questionable political goals. Of course, that may be true, and that may be important, but that isn't all. Even after particularly dramatic and threatening episodes of violence have faded from popular emphasis, as may someday happen even for 9/11, another question is whether the altered social and political balance of liberty and security will last, or will it be reset? And can such a resetting occur in the face of political and bureaucratic institutions that have been freshly created precisely in order to emphasize international and homeland security over liberty or even democracy? Thank you for having me here.